A continuación tenemos una videoconferencia y nuestro siguiente expositor es Robin Murray. Robin es economista industrial. Su trabajo reciente se ha centrado en cooperación interempresarial y en los proyectos de la economía social. Es miembro de la Young Foundation, donde ha elaborado el trabajo sobre los métodos de innovación social y ambiental, y es asociado de las cooperativas del Reino Unido, el organismo que agrupa a más de 5.000 cooperativas británicas, en donde preparó estrategias para la expansión de las cooperativas en la próxima década. Robin Murray nos presenta el tema Competencia Cooperativa, Experiencia Europea de Colaboración entre Empresas. No sé si ya lo tenemos listo a Robin.
Sí.
Good evening.
Yes.
From London. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I would like to talk to you about some of our experiences in Europe over the last 20 or 30 years on the subject of cooperation between firms. When I was growing up and in my first period as a professional, the model that we as economists were following was that of scale. And when we were worried about British performance, the aim of industrial policy right through to the late 1970s, early 1980s was to say that we were too small, we had too many family firms, and that what needed to happen was that we needed more amalgamations and mergers and investment in large machinery and to have professional managers instead of the family managers of small companies. And that was what we all accepted, left or right, local or national. And in the early 1980s, I was working for the municipality of London, the Greater London Council, which faced an enormous, for Britain, an enormous problem of unemployment. The kind of problem that you in Ecuador and others in Latin America have faced for much longer. But we had in London alone over 500,000 people unemployed. And so we set up a development bank, and as the industries that we had in London started to collapse, we followed this principle of scale and of industrial policy that I've just described. So we bought up these firms from the receivers, we amalgamated them, many of them were family firms. We put new management in and we provided investment capital to retool them and make them fit for modern competition. Well, that all looked fine, but when these new firms, as it were, these amalgamated firms, in the furniture we had something over 1,000 workers by this time, when we were competing in the marketplace, we found that in spite of our policy, we were being outcompeted by continental and particularly Italian manufacturers. We could not understand it. It wasn't just 5% cheaper. It was that sometimes they were 20 or 30% cheaper and also very much higher quality. So one of my colleagues, we asked if he would go over and look at who these Italians were. And we expected him to come back and tell us that the Italians had huge factories of 4,000 or more workers. And that what we needed to do was to amalgamate our 1,000 workers with other factories so that we could match them on 4,000 workers. This was in about 1983. Well, I remember him coming back and we all sat down and he said, well, I've been to one of the areas which is very strong in competition, with us, which was a little place in the region of Tuscany called Poggibonsi. And he said, I'm afraid to say, the largest firm I found in that district had 45 workers. I think there was one actually with 60. He said, but the secret of the place, and I've spent 2 weeks there, he said, was that there were well over 80 firms. We couldn't believe him. And we said, well, how is that? And he said, well, what they've established is a specialism between each of these firms. Some of them made the legs. Some of them made the backs. Some of them did the upholstery. There were others which were specialists in finishing, in spraying machines and so on. And what we realized is that together, that they had actually created a small kind of system which together might have 2,000 workers. But individually, they only had these 20 to 50 workers that I was talking about. So their emphasis that we found in furniture, and it was true then, we found in clothing, in many of the other light industrial sectors, shoes was another one, is that they put a lot of emphasis on design, on quality, and particularly on innovating new products and processes. And they did this because each of these firms was their own master. And even if there were other people also doing the same type of furniture, they would be, if you like, in friendly competition, rather like running a race at school with friends. And if one of them succeeded in getting an order, very often it was far too big for this small firm. They would then share it out amongst those who might have come second or third in the race. That was the first thing we learned. The second one that he told us, and he'd been to other districts as well, is that they developed a way of together collaborating in order to produce certain services which required scale. And these included market research overseas and locally. It included sales. It included going round the world and finding the latest technology. I still remember taking a group of Cypriot industrialists to see a little district like this. They could not believe that a firm which was no more than half a dozen people in what looked like a garage had the most modern spraying equipment in the world. Now, all these functions, what they did is they established formal consortia or cooperatives between themselves, function by function. They didn't do it all together. One of them would be sales, and you'd have in these workshops, you'd have very smart young people with young men with narrow, small briefcases, and they'd all been off selling in Japan or the United States. And one of these consortia was about finance. They would provide guarantees for each other so that finance was not an issue. And when some of these firms grew because they were successful, bits of them would then spin out, but maintain the connections that they had historically. And of course, one of the secrets was that many of them had been to school together. They knew each other. They weren't moving from place to place according to what happened to be the cheapest at that time. They were there, on the whole, they were there for a lifetime. Well, this was a very big lesson for us. And as I say, it took us, I would say, a year or two to understand that here was a quite different industrial model. That you could have small specialist firms which together made up large systems. So it wasn't about small firms v. big firms. It was about how you made a big industrial system, whether it was centralized and organized on the basis of a pyramid, or whether it was decentralized, or as we would call it, distributed, connected in all the ways that I've just described. And the Italian model preserved a kind of autonomy and creativity, but supported by these collective services. Now, in many of these sectors, the Italians became and have become leaders in Europe. And I have just, once we understood the model, we could see how strong it was. So that in footwear, for example, the big mass-produced footwear companies, they could not sustain themselves against the very high-quality Italian shoes. In ceramic tiles, one after another of the big companies in Europe have been knocked out by networks of ceramic tile firms which produce the highest quality, wonderfully designed ceramic tiles. So they were not competing in the what I'll call an Anglo-Saxon manner, the kind of thing that I was brought up in. They are cooperating in order to strengthen their competition, their competitiveness in the world. So we always have to ask, with whom do we cooperate and with whom are we competing? And with those people with whom we're cooperating, we are not competing, because the nature of international competition is such that we have to stick together and develop this type of system in order to hold our own. Some of the firms were actual cooperatives. I mean, if you think of Parmesan cheese, which you may have heard of in Ecuador, this is produced by nearly 1,000 small producers, but who have established a common set of rules for production and for sales and for branding, which has made it a worldwide brand. And the same with the ceramic. The largest ceramic tile in Europe is also a cooperative. And what this has meant is that gradually during the 1980s and 90s, as people began researching this, they found that there were other districts like this in Europe, notably in Denmark. The company from which Lego emerged was one of these small companies which then grew large after the war. In parts of Sweden, in Germany, very strong. That all these we had disregarded in the 1970s. We thought these were pre-modern and needed to be modernized. And what we learnt over that period was actually that they were possibly postmodern, that they were not just a relic of the future, of the past, but a possible picture of the future. Now, we also found this in Spain, in the areas of Valencia, for example. The most famous one, which I suspect many of you will know, is the Mondragon cooperative in the Basque region. The network of, is it now, about 120, is it 120 to 150 co-ops, anyway, employing 80,000 workers. And what I want to say about, which comes out clearly in Mondragon, which is, after all, a cooperative of cooperatives. In Italy, you could call it a cooperative of small family firms. In Italy, in Spain, it is a cooperative of cooperatives. But because I want us to look, I want to say about what we've understood about these complex systems is what Mondragon has brought right to the fore are those essential services you have got to do collectively. The four that they always pick out, number one, and I would always pick this out, is learning, education. And in the case of Mondragon, it is their university. Whenever you have an industrial district or specializing like this, you have to have a learning institution, an academy. Now, in Italy, this is provided by local training colleges. In Mondragon, they started with training colleges, but they've now put it up to a university. But that's number one. The second is you need a bank, which Mondragon developed within themselves, their own internal bank, rather like big firms, actually, now are their own banks. Well, Mondragon set up its own bank for their system. Thirdly, and linked to the bank, which made it the most, in my professional life, it's easily the most effective development bank that I know, because they had a separate section, which was a business development, a cooperative development unit, who would work with the new producers to develop their business plan, their skills, their knowledge, send them all over the world to see the latest technology. And only when, sometimes after 2 years, they had done this and proved themselves, did they then hand it over to the bank and say, okay, now they're ready for financing. And lastly, which has come more and more significant over the last 20 years, they've developed research and development laboratories, not just one, but 2 or 3. And in each case, you need to have a capacity which can serve, in this case, to serve an industry, which can keep you right up to date with international competition. They also, they don't emphasize this, but if you look at Mondragon, that's what they have. They need overseas sales. So they have an overseas sales force on behalf now of a number of these. They have representatives in China and so on. They need marketing, consultancy, and they need the key role of strategy. Because Spain, like I suspect Ecuador, and certainly Britain, is subject not only, in our case, to increased European competition, but to global competition, which constantly requires a reassessment of a firm or an industry strategy. So my suggestion is that these points that I have made would normally be provided within a big firm, within the firm, by the head office of the firm. But within these distributed systems, they've got to be provided on behalf of all the firms. And in the most successful ones, it is the firms, the operating firms, who control these collective services. And if they're not working properly, it is the firms who contribute to their cash, to their costs, who then ask for a change of management. It is the user, in this sense, of these services controls them. Well, now, what is striking about this model, distributed model, bound together by a system of collaborative institutions, it is the first thing that researchers have found over this period was that some large firms, particularly those in new technology sectors, ones where technology was rapidly developing, have developed internally a model rather similar to the ones I'm talking about. So if you like, behind what appears to be a single firm, there is much greater decentralization and autonomy to the local operating units, and, following the Japanese principle, a much greater involvement of the workforce in the day-to-day, continuous innovation, and so on. So it isn't just these districts versus the big firms, it is how the big firms themselves are organized, and the pressure is on the big firms to have systems which allow the same degree of autonomy and creativity. Something I've been working on recently is banking. And it's very interesting to see that at long last, banking is being reassessed in the light of what I'm talking about. what people have discovered in Britain, where our banks have been in such very grievous, a very grievous calamity since 2008, is that people have now rediscovered that in Germany, in Austria, in northern Italy, and in Holland, there is this distributed kind of Italian-style model operating in banking. It's not, it astonishes people to know that in Germany there are over 1,000 separate cooperative banks. I was recently in the region of Trentino in the North Italy. It has 500,000 people and 46 separate cooperative banks. Now, this is astonishing, and it operates in Germany side by side with small municipal banks, which have together the co-ops and the small local municipal banks have the great majority of the retail banking sector. And why? Because they are able to give relational banking. They know their borrowers and they know the firms, and they are able to take assessments on the basis of what they know about them, just like in the Italian districts, not on the basis of algorithms and, if you like, statistical analysis, which is what the large firms are doing. And you cannot understand the success of the German small and medium industry, which is called the Mittelstand, and which has been behind the fact that Germany has survived the recession much better than anywhere else in Europe, and is now the strongest economy in Europe. The Mittelstand, particularly in the engineering sector, is at the heart of this. And this is based on family firms, small family firms, with institutions of this kind, and which have been financed by the local banking system, this close relationship between them. And what is now happening is that we are finding that this distributed banking system is being enabled by ICT developments, which allow the local bank to tap into modern technology with which to develop their products. And just like the Italian firms, these banks have regional and national cooperative bodies which they control that provide those functions which any large bank, any bank must have to be efficient. But it's a very different type of banking system to the one that we have in Anglo-Saxon countries. Now, all this was a gradual realization, and it changed policy. Small firms never came into industrial policy until, I would say, the late 80s or early 90s. And policy then changed. But then, because the world is moving so quickly, what happened with globalization is that the Italian districts and Mondragon and the other districts I'm talking about faced increasing global competition. And some of them have found it very difficult to hold their own. The latest material and research and people who've worked on this, who I was talking to recently, say that some of them have lost the position they had up until the early 1990s. But the ones who are still strong, who have dominated their own sectors and which have survived against the competition, particularly from the Far East, are marked by two things that I've mentioned. One is an intense awareness of the international state of play as regards technology. This has been absolutely crucial. They've got to be open to the world if they are to compete with the world. That was one. The second is that they emphasize innovation, either drawn from abroad or developed by themselves. Very interesting case that I visited recently is in the machine sector. And the machine sector is faced with the fact that the Chinese can copy any machine developed in Italy very rapidly with modern technology, and then re-export it to Europe, obviously with much cheaper wages. But what the machinery makers in Italy have done is to reconceptualize themselves as service providers, of which machinery is part of the business, but machinery which they constantly update. So you're offering a kind of modern machinery service together with advice, know-how, and maintenance. And they are now holding their own, not only in Italy against the Chinese, but in other parts of Europe. Well, now, the principle that I've been talking about, which is how enterprises need to cooperate in order to compete, is very hard for enterprises reared in the Anglo-Saxon culture of antagonistic relations, where everyone outside the management and the owners, but the management, I would say, is the key one, is regarded as subject to these antagonistic relations, whether they be the workers or the suppliers or the clients or the banks. That what their business is to do is to strike the best bargain, not to establish long-term relations, but to follow the market, to follow what the market indicates. And it is very difficult for those brought up in that, shaped by that way of thinking, to develop a knowledge base, one which is adequate to the knowledge economy with continuous change. Instead, I'm suggesting it is this open tradition which has got long historical roots of the industrial districts, such as the ones I've described, which are based on long-term relations, on trust, what we might call relational capital, which does not appear in balance sheets, but which from my experience is absolutely key, which takes a long time to build up. Between enterprises, with the workforces, with the suppliers, with the clients, and, very important, with the most innovative local authorities. It's not just any partnership. It has to be a partnership where everyone is sharing the same perspective, whether they are worker, owner, authority, local authority, or bank. In my view, Henry Ford can be taken as symbolizing the productive and organizational system of the mass production age. This is why we call it now Fordism. Now we can see it in the back mirror of our economic history. We might think that the open source software principle, which I gather that you've been discussing, as a means of tapping into social knowledge, when knowledge is so critical to modern production. This, we could think, may be a symbol for our era. A symbol relevant throughout our economies, not just through the development of software, of the productive power of cooperation without borders. And if you were to take away from what I've said the three key points, one is this idea of cooperation between firms and all the complexities, the qualitative aspects that involves. That is itself a subject of study, and I suspect some of those of you who are listening to this have experienced it themselves. I've been involved for 25 years with fair trade, including, I may say, with Ecuador banana producers. And this issue of cooperation, relational capital, has underlain the enormous success of fair trade in Europe, particularly in Britain. That's the first one. The second one is to pay detailed attention to the things that in any system are necessary for that system to function as a system. Now, I've described some of those things. These, I invite you to study, if you haven't already done so, to study this within firms and then between firms in these clusters, which now, of course, there are now many examples in Latin America as well. There's another tradition which is helpful in this, which is that of which is called viable systems, the viable systems model, associated with the cybernetician Stafford Beer, which was developed in Chile under Allende and has now spread. I believe in Colombia is now being used. It's certainly been used in Britain. And the value of the viable systems model is that it tries to pinpoint some of the key issues. One of them is strategy, which we've discussed. A second, which is for them crucial, is to institutionalize this scanning of the world, the scanning of the outside, to ensure that the system remains open. Because the moment a system, whether a firm or a group of firms, starts closing in on itself, it is in trouble. So that's the second set of points. And the last, which is a very striking thing for the last 10 years, is that more and more the new technologies are showing that you can now have this model of distributed production, which is a more effective way of managing complexity than the large centralized systems. It's very clear with energy, where you can either have very large centralized energy, like nuclear power or large power plants, as against decentralized systems based on renewables and the saving of energy use. And it is again very interesting that and banking would be true as well, but in the case of energy, the Germans have taken the lead now from the Danes in Europe. They've already got 25% of their energy coming from renewables, done on a distributed basis, and funded supported by state funds, channeled through the local banks that I was talking about. So there's a matching. You can develop distributed systems of production which actually allow a much greater and fairer distribution of industry and economic welfare throughout a country than when that is centralized in certain places. Thank you very much.